A cowboy gave his only horse to a wounded Apache. The next day, 70 warriors did the unthinkable. In the fading light of the 1870s, when the Arizona Territory still bore the wounds of conflict in the hush of lawless land, there lived a man named Luke Carver. His days unfolded in solitude on a modest spread of dry, cracked land that had once belonged to his father. Luke was a cowboy by necessity, not by nature. One of the rare breed who neither drank nor swore, who kept himself and rarely stepped beyond the barbed boundaries of his ranch. His closest neighbors were miles away. The post came once a week, if the stage hadn't been robbed. And news, when it traveled, came slow and twisted by distance. In this part of the world, people disappeared more often than they arrived. There were still skirmishes, though the newspapers in Washington called the wars over. Men like Luke knew better. They saw the scars written in the land itself, in the abandoned campsites, the burned wagons, the silent glances shared in saloons. Luke didn't speak much of his past, and no one inquired. Folks in these parts lived like ghosts, each guarding their own shadows. His routine was clockwork. Rise before the sun, tend to the cattle, mend what was broken, and retreat before dusk. The only sound at night was a whistle of wind across dry stones and the occasional cry of coyotes chasing ghosts of their own. It was during one such routine that the wind began to shift. On a morning like any other, Luke mounted his horse and set out to look for a calf gone missing from the southern fence line. The summer heat had cracked the earth, and the air shimmered with dust and stillness. As he rode across a dry creek bed and climbed over a ridge of pale stone, something caught his eye among the rocks below, a shape too still to be natural. He dismounted slowly, his hand resting near the revolver at his belt. As he approached, he saw it was a man, half covered by dust and blood. The stranger was young, barely more than a boy, with black hair tangled against a face twisted in pain. An arrow shaft had snapped near his side, and a gunshot wound in his leg had soaked through his clothing with dried blood. His skin was copper-toned, his jewelry made of bone and turquoise. There was no mistaking it. Apache. Luke hesitated. He had been raised to be cautious, not cruel. He had heard stories of ambushes and raiding parties. He had seen the work of both white and native violence, had passed through ghost towns left behind by the violence of pride and fear. But looking down at the wounded man, Luke felt no fear, only weight, a heavy, quiet weight pressing on his chest. The Apache stirred, barely conscious, his eyes fluttering open to meet Luke's. They held no anger, no plea, just silence, a silence that asked without asking. Luke looked at his horse, his only horse, and then back at the man. Without a word, he knelt, unstrapped the saddle, and looped the reins gently into the Apache's trembling hands. He braced the man's shoulders, helping him rise. With the last of his strength, the Apache mounted. For a long, still moment, the two men stared at each other, breathing the same dry air. Then the Apache nodded once, slow, solemn, and turned the horse toward the horizon. Luke watched until they vanished between the red rocks and sagebrush. Then he was alone. He had no water, no shelter. The sun beat down mercilessly as the hours dragged by. By sundown, the air turned bitter and cold. Coyotes howled nearby, but Luke didn't move. He pressed his back to a sun-warmed stone, arms folded across his chest, and closed his eyes. He didn't think of rescue. He didn't pray. He didn't regret. He simply waited. And above him, the stars began to emerge one by one, distant and unblinking, watching over a man who had given everything to a stranger and had no idea what would come next. The desert at night is a world of its own, and Luke Carver had learned long ago how to bend his body into the crevices of stone and make peace with the sounds that prowled around him. The earth gave back the heat it had absorbed all day, warming his spine even as the night air cut sharp across his face. He had no blanket, no fire, and no horse to share the burden of silence. Only his own breath in the endless sky. When dawn crept across the horizon, Luke stirred, his body stiff from the cold. His throat was dry, his lips cracked, but he pushed himself upright with a patience born of habit. The world was waking slowly. Hawks circling overhead, lizards darting between stones, the first sliver of sunlight cutting across the ridges. Luke rubbed his eyes, and when his vision cleared, he saw something that made him freeze. A trail of disturbed dust wound between the rocks not far from where he had slept. It wasn't there the night before. He crouched low, scanning the line of prints. They were fresh, barely hours old. He followed them with his eyes until they vanished into the wider stretch of desert, heading east. Luke straightened, jaw tight. The prints belonged to horses, several of them. That meant movement during the night, movement he hadn't noticed while drifting in and out of restless sleep. He didn't need to guess what kind of men had passed. He had been in Arizona long enough to know that soldiers patrolled these lands with increasing frequency, and when they came across wounded Apaches, mercy was never part of their orders. He set off on foot, his boots crunching against the gravel. Without his horse, the walk was punishing, but he pressed forward, searching for shade where he could rest briefly. The heat grew heavier with every step, and the landscape stretched mercilessly in every direction. He carried nothing but the revolver at his side and a determination that seemed more instinct than reason. By late morning, the sun had climbed high enough to bake the stone beneath his feet. His vision blurred, and he dropped to one knee, pulling his hat lower to shield his eyes. Ahead, in the distance, something caught the light. A flicker of movement, maybe a figure. He blinked, unsure if it was real or another cruel mirage. Slowly, shapes sharpened, jagged rocks forming a natural hollow, and within it, the faint outline of a man slumped against stone. Luke moved closer, cautious, his hand resting on the revolver, though he doubted his strength to use it. As he drew near, he saw it was the same young Apache from the day before. The man's skin gleamed with sweat, his breathing ragged. The horse Luke had given him stood tethered to a bush nearby, head bowed, sides heaving. The Apache's leg was bound with strips of cloth, stained dark. Luke stopped a few feet away, uncertain whether to speak. But the Apache's eyes opened, fixing on him. There was no surprise there, only an exhausted awareness, as though he had expected Luke to return. "You should ride," Luke said quietly, his voice rasping. "You won't get far sitting here." The Apache tilted his head, studying him in silence, then gestured faintly toward a leather pouch by his side. Luke hesitated but stepped closer and knelt. Inside, he found a small amount of water. He lifted it, holding it out, but the Apache pushed it back toward him with weak insistence. Luke stared at the pouch, then at the young man. The desert had ways of stripping men down to their core, and what he saw in that moment wasn't the enemy his neighbor spoke of. It was simply another man trying to survive. He drank sparingly, the water barely enough to wet his tongue, and handed it back. The Apache's lips moved then, forming words broken by effort. "Nakai." Luke frowned. "Is that your name?" The man nodded once, his eyes never leaving Luke's face. Luke sank back on his heels, letting the silence stretch. He had no idea why fate had twisted their paths together, nor what it would cost him. But now the Apache had a name, and names had a way of making strangers harder to forget. The sound of distant hooves shattered the fragile moment. Luke tensed, his hand instinctively gripping the revolver. Nakai's had lifted, his expression tightening. He reached for the knife at his side, though his hand shook with weakness. Luke turned toward the sound. Riders approached fast, the dust of their passage rising like a pale cloud against the horizon. He counted at least half a dozen, maybe more. Their formation was tight, their intent unmistakable. Soldiers. Luke glanced at Nakai, then at the horse. He had already given up his only means of escape. There was no chance to run now, not for either of them. "Stay low," Luke muttered, though he wasn't sure Nakai understood. The riders closed in, their voices sharp, echoing across the rocks. Luke rose slowly, his revolver at his side, but not raised. He knew enough to realize that a single shot would mean his death before he even hit the ground. Dust swirled around them as the soldiers pulled up, their uniforms marked with the dirt and were of long patrols. The man at the front, a lieutenant by his insignia, glared down at Luke. "What are you doing out here, cowboy?" the officer demanded. His eyes narrowed, shifting past Luke toward the figure slumped against a stone. "And who's that?" Luke's mouth felt dry as sand. He forced himself to meet the man's gaze. "Just found him. He's hurt." The lieutenant swung down from his horse, boots striking the ground with a heavy thud. He walked past Luke, squatting in front of Nakai. The young Apache met his stare with defiance that made Luke's chest tighten. "This one's been running," the lieutenant said coldly. "You're lucky he didn't slit your throat in your sleep." "He didn't," Luke replied evenly. The officer's head turned sharply, his eyes narrowing at Luke's tone. After a long pause, he stood and gestured to his men. "Take him." 2 soldiers dismounted, stepping toward Nakai with ropes in hand. Without thinking, Luke moved. He stepped in front of the Apache, his hand resting near his revolver, though he didn't draw. The soldiers stopped, startled. "What are you doing?" the lieutenant barked. Luke's voice was steady, though his heart hammered in his chest. "He's wounded. If you drag him like that, he won't make a mile." The lieutenant studied him, lips curling into a thin smile. "You seem awful concerned for a man who's your enemy." Luke didn't answer. The silence stretched until the officer's smile faded. With a sharp gesture, he signaled his men to hold back. "Fine. Have it your way, cowboy. But you've put yourself on a list you don't want to be on." He mounted his horse again, casting one last look at Luke. "Next time we come through, we'll be less forgiving." With that, the patrol wheeled around and rode off, the thunder of hooves fading into the desert. Luke stood motionless until the dust settled, his pulse still racing. Then he turned back to Nakai, who had watched the exchange in silence. For the first time, the young Apache spoke more than a word. His voice was hoarse but firm. "Why?" Luke looked at him, unsure how to answer. Why had he stepped in front of soldiers armed with rifles? Why had he put his own life on the line for someone he barely knew? Finally, he shook his head, because it was the right thing to do. Nakai's gaze lingered on him, unreadable. Then, slowly, he nodded. The desert wind rose again, carrying with it a sense that something had shifted, something larger than the 2 men who sat in the shadow of the rocks. Luke felt it like a weight in his chest. He knew the soldiers would be back, and when they returned, they would not come with questions. That night, as the sun bled across the horizon and the stars prepared to reclaim the sky, Luke understood he had crossed a line. There was no turning back now. The second night fell heavy and strange. The desert hushed except for the faint shifting of sand and the crackle of distant coyotes. Luke Carver had found a shallow hollow where jagged rock leaned against itself, creating just enough cover to shelter him and the Apache he had now learned to call Nakai. They hadn't spoken much since the soldiers had left earlier that day. Nakai's silence was not the silence of weakness, but of watchfulness, as if he were measuring Luke against something unseen. Luke, on the other hand, was fighting his own thoughts. The encounter with the soldiers still burned in his chest. Their warning had been clear. He knew men like that. They didn't speak idly. If they had marked him, sooner or later they would return with harsher intent. He should have walked away then, left Nakai to his own fate, but some invisible thread had tightened around his decisions. It wasn't pity nor simple morality. It was a weight he could not shrug off. Sometime after midnight, Luke drifted into restless sleep. The wind shifted cold, sweeping fine dust into his hair, and his dreams were filled with fragments he couldn't piece together. Faces from his childhood, his father's voice, and the sound of hooves beating like drums. At dawn, he woke not to silence, but to a deep, rolling thrum in the ground beneath him. At first, he thought it was thunder, but the sky was clear, painted with the pale hues of early morning. He sat up, heart tightening, and Nakai stirred beside him, his dark eyes instantly alert. The sound grew stronger, steady, deliberate, unmistakable. Hoofbeats, not the erratic noise of a few riders, but a measured rhythm of many moving together. Luke rose, climbing a short ridge to see beyond the rocks. What met his eyes made him freeze. Stretching across the desert floor, riding in deliberate silence, came a column of mounted Apache warriors. Not 5, not 10, but far more, rows upon rows, their silhouettes black against the rising sun. Their ponies moved with calm precision, heads bobbing in unison, dust curling around their legs like smoke. Luke's breath caught as he counted, his chest tightening with disbelief. There were not dozens, but scores of them, 70 at least. The riders slowed as they reached the hollow where he and Nakai had taken shelter. They spread outward in a wide circle, their horses stamping softly. the warriors' faces set in grim stillness. Each man carried the weight of the desert in his eyes, unflinching, proud, unreadable. From among them, one figure dismounted. He was older, his presence commanding though he carried no weapon in hand. His hair was streaked with gray, braided with strips of leather. His chest bore the scars of battles long past. He walked forward slowly, each step deliberate, until he stood before Luke and Nakai. Luke's mouth had gone dry, but he held his ground, though every instinct told him to step back. The man's gaze lingered on him for a long, silent moment before shifting to Nakai. Something unspoken passed between them. The older warrior reached down, taking the reins of Luke's horse, the very animal he had given away, and placed him in Nakai's hands. Nakai accepted, his movements steady though his body still bore the stiffness of pain. Luke felt his stomach twist. He had expected many things in this land, but not this. The warriors surrounding him did not jeer, did not threaten, did not even whisper. Their silence was heavier than any words could have been. The older man then turned his eyes back to Luke. In a slow, measured motion, he extended his arm, holding out a small leather water pouch and a strip of dried meat. His expression did not soften, nor did it harden. It was solemn, as if this gesture carried meaning deeper than Luke could comprehend. Luke accepted both, his hand steady though his pulse thudded against his ribs. He wanted to speak, but the weight of their silence pressed against his chest like stone. Words would have felt clumsy, even offensive. So he bowed his head once, a small gesture of acknowledgement, and tucked the offerings close. The old warrior gave a slight nod, then turned, mounting his horse again with the ease of a man who had lived more in the saddle than on the ground. With a signal too subtle for Luke to see, the circle of riders shifted. They began to pull away, still silent, still watching him as if fixing his face in memory. The sound of 70 horses moving in unison was a living thing, a deep pulse that seemed to echo inside Luke's bones. When the dust of their passing began to settle, only Nakai remained in the hollow with him, holding the reins of the horse Luke had thought he'd lost for good. Nakai's gaze met his briefly, unreadable as ever, before he turned and mounted with a strength that had not been there the day before. His leg was wrapped more tightly now, the wound treated with care Luke knew he hadn't provided. For the first time, Nakai spoke in a voice stronger than the broken syllables he'd managed earlier. "You gave what you could not spare." He paused, the words deliberate, shaped by effort. "They see." Luke frowned slightly, tried to read the weight behind those words, but Nakai did not explain further. Instead, the young Apache nudged the horse forward, guiding it toward the horizon where the rest of the warriors had vanished. Luke stood alone again, holding the water pouch and dried meat, his mind reeling. He could not decide whether he had been spared, honored, or warned. Perhaps all three. By late morning, the heat had returned in full. Luke made his way back toward his ranch, step by weary step, the silence of the encounter ringing louder in his ears than gunfire ever could. When he finally saw the faint outline of his cabin rising from the dust, a strange mix of relief and dread settled over him. His cattle were scattered near the fence line, their slow chewing indifferent to the weight of what had just unfolded. The wind rattled the tin roof of the barn. Everything looked the same, yet Luke felt something had shifted irreversibly. That night, as he sat by the dim light of a lantern in his small cabin, the silence pressed in again. But this silence was different. It carried memory, presence, a reminder of 70 pairs of eyes watching him without speaking a single word. He had thought the desert was empty. He knew now it was anything but. And though his body longed for rest, his mind refused it. The image of those riders would not leave him, nor the echo of Nakai's words. They see. Luke had no way of knowing what that meant for his future, only that the desert, once his quiet prison, had opened a door he could not close. The following morning arrived with a pale sky, streaked in rose and gray, the kind of light that promised a scorching afternoon. Luke Carver moved through familiar spaces of his small ranch with the uneasy sense that everything had shifted. The cattle lowed lazily at the edges of the pasture. The windmill creaked in its slow circle, and yet none of it felt like the life he had known before. He couldn't shake the weight of the 70 riders who had encircled him at dawn the day before, nor the steady gaze of the older Apache who had handed him water and meat without a word. By midday, Luke busied himself repairing a section of fence that had been broken by a storm weeks earlier. Sweat rolled down his back, and the sun burned unforgiving, but work was the only thing that steadied his thoughts. The silence of the land pressing on him until the sharp sound of hooves reached his ears. He froze, his hammer suspended in midair. From a northern ridge came several riders, but these were not Apache. Their uniforms were unmistakable, army blue, dust-stained but disciplined in formation. At their head rode an officer with stern features, his hat pulled low over his brow. The soldiers slowed as they approached the house, their rifles slung casually, but with enough menace to remind Luke of what they carried. The officer reined in his horse near the porch, his eyes sweeping over Luke with suspicion. "Name?" "Luke Carver," Luke replied. His voice calm, though his pulse had quickened. The officer dismounted, his boots hitting the ground with a deliberate weight of authority. He stepped closer, eyes narrowing as he studied Luke. "We're looking for an Apache. Young, injured, shot in the leg. You seen anyone like that?" Luke's jaw tightened. He kept his face still, offering nothing. "I haven't seen anyone." The officer's gaze lingered on him, searching for cracks in his composure. Then, with a flick of his hand, he gestured for his men to spread out. They moved with quick efficiency, pushing open the barn doors, stomping to the corral, even stepping inside Luke's small cabin without so much as a word of permission. Luke stood perfectly still, every muscle tense, his revolver heavy at his side. After several long minutes, the soldiers emerged again. They had found nothing, of course, but the officer did not look satisfied. He stepped close to Luke, his eyes cold. "If you're lying, Carver, it won't end well for you. The one we're after isn't just another raider. He's dangerous, marked. You do well to remember where your loyalties belong." Luke met his stare without flinching. "I told you the truth." For a moment, it seemed the officer might push harder. Then he gave a sharp nod to his men. "Mount up." The soldiers returned to their saddles, and the officer swung onto his horse with practiced ease. Before turning away, he leaned down slightly, his voice dropping low. "Stay out of this, cowboy. That's the only advice you're going to get." With that, the group rode off, their dust cloud trailing into horizon. Luke exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders releasing by degrees. He had half expected them to drag him into town, to press him harder, but for now, they were gone. He returned to his fence, though his hand shook slightly as he raised a hammer. The afternoon passed in heavy silence, broken only by the creak of wood and the call of distant birds. Luke worked until the light began to fade, then made his way inside, lighting his lantern as the desert dusk spread across the land. He ate a simple meal of beans and bread, though his appetite was thin. He thought of Nakai, of the old warrior, of the circle of riders, and he thought of the officer's warning, the cold weight behind his words. That night, sleep came slow. His dreams were restless, filled with shifting shapes of riders and soldiers, of dust rising into the endless sky. When he finally woke, the moon was high, casting pale light across the desert. Something had changed. He could feel it before he even opened his door. At his gate, hanging carefully on the wooden post, was something that hadn't been there before. Luke stepped forward cautiously, lantern in hand, the light flickering against the dry earth. There, tied with leather cord, hung a necklace of Apache make. It was intricate, woven with colored beads and feathers that swayed softly in the night breeze. Beside it, leaning against the wood, was a small knife. Its handle was carved with symbols Luke didn't understand, the blade gleaming faintly in the lantern's glow. He reached out, touching the objects with reverence. They had been left deliberately, placed where only he would find them. Gratitude? A warning? Perhaps both. Luke untied the necklace and knife, holding them carefully as he turned back toward the house. Inside, he laid them on the table, staring at them in the flickering light. The symbols on the knife seemed to carry a meaning he couldn't yet grasp, and the necklace pulsed with a weight that felt heavier than its beads. He thought of the old warrior again, of Nakai's words. "They see." The creak of footsteps on his porch made him start. He spun, revolver drawn, but when he opened the door, he found only his neighbor, Earl Whitman, standing in the moonlight. Earl was a stout man, older, his beard graying and his eyes sharp with suspicion. "What in hell is it you've got there?" Earl asked, pointing to the necklace Luke still held in his hand. Luke's eyes narrowed. "Where were you looking, Earl?" "Don't need to look far when a man's holding Apache charms in plain sight." Earl spat in the dust, his expression grim. "You don't know what you've stepped into, Carver. Those people don't forget. Not kindness, not blood. You tie yourself to them. You'll carry their shadow to the end of your days." Luke lowered the revolver, slipping it back into his belt. "Maybe I don't care about shadows." Earl studied him for a long moment, his face creased with something that looked almost like pity. "You should," he said quietly, "especially if the name Taza means anything to you." Luke stiffened. The name was unfamiliar on his tongue, but it struck something deep in his memory, as though it had been written in the land itself long before he was born. Earl gave a final shake of his head. "Best burn those things, Carver. Pretend this never touched your land. If you don't, you'll wish you had." With that, the older man turned and walked back into the night, his figure soon swallowed by the desert. Luke remained at the doorway, the necklace and knife still in his hands, the name echoing in his mind like a distant drum. Taza. He knew then that whatever had begun when he gave his horse to a wounded stranger was far from over, and the desert, vast and merciless, was holding secrets he had barely begun to uncover. The morning after Earl Whitman's visit was sharp and windless, the air holding the kind of silence that made Luke Carver feel every creak of wood in his cabin, every scrape of metal as he cleaned his tools. He had placed the Apache necklace and the ritual knife in a wooden box beneath his bed, though their presence weighed on him like a second heartbeat. Earl's warning lingered, circling his thoughts like vultures. "Burn them," Earl had said. "Pretend it never touched your land." But Luke couldn't. Something in him refused to destroy what had been deliberately entrusted to him. He stepped out onto the porch with a mug of bitter coffee just as dust rose on the southern horizon. His stomach clenched. Another group of riders was approaching. This time, there was no mistaking their formation, straight, rigid, the sun flashing off polished buttons and rifle barrels. Soldiers again. Luke set his cup down and waited, his shoulders squared though unease gnawed at him. The group halted at his gate. Their leader, not the same officer as before, but another man, leaner and colder in expression, dismounted. His voice carried the authority of someone who had been given a mission and would see it through regardless of consequence. "Luke Carver," the officer called, "you've been named in reports. We've reason to believe you've had contact with hostile Apache elements. You'll answer some questions." Luke kept his tone level. "I've answered questions already. I told the truth." The officer's eyes flicked toward the barn, and then back at Luke. "Then you won't mind if we take another look." Without waiting for consent, he signaled his men. They moved fast, rifles at the ready, fanning out across Luke's property. He didn't move, though every nerve in his body screamed to intervene. The barn doors were flung open, hay and tools overturned. Two men pushed into the cabin, their boots grinding against his wooden floorboards. He heard the crash of a chair falling, the clatter of pots and pans. His jaw tightened, but he stayed rooted, knowing one wrong move could end with bullets. The officer watched him the whole time, his gaze sharp and probing. "There's a fugitive out here," he said finally. "A young Apache warrior. He's dangerous. He's killed men. You protect someone like that, and you'll hang beside him." Luke didn't answer. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction of fear in his voice. Minutes later, the soldiers emerged, empty-handed. They had searched everywhere, but had not found a hidden box beneath Luke's bed, nor any sign of Nakai. The officer's mouth twisted, not in defeat, but in calculation. He stepped close, lowering his voice. "You think you're clever, cowboy, but men who play both sides always get crushed between them. Stay clear of this. Next time, there won't be questions, only chains." With that, he mounted his horse. The patrol wheeled away, their departure raising a fresh cloud of dust that settled slowly over Luke's land like a shroud. When the last echo of hooves had faded, Luke entered the cabin. The place was a mess, drawers pulled out, blankets tossed aside, shelves knocked down. He cleaned in silence, each movement measured. What unsettled him most wasn't the intrusion, but the uncertainty gnawing at him. Why was this young Apache so hunted? Why had 70 warriors surrounded him and then let him go? Why had they given him water and meat, and why had someone left him gifts at his gate? That night, he sat at the table with a lantern burning low. The necklace and knife lay before him again, their colors and carvings alive in the flickering light. His mind turned back to Earl's words, to the name Taza. He whispered it once aloud, testing its weight in the air. The sound seemed to belong here, as though it had been waiting in the cabin long before Luke was born. The following day brought no riders, but the quiet was heavier than before, as though the desert itself was holding its breath. Luke went about his work, mending fences, checking water troughs, cutting wood, but every sound carried a sharpened edge. When dusk came, he sat outside, watching the horizon until stars pricked the sky. The stillness broke with the sound of footsteps. Not horses this time, but lighter, quicker, careful in their approach. Luke's hand went to his revolver as a figure emerged from the dark. It was a young woman, her features catching the lamplight as she drew closer. She was neither fully Apache nor fully white. Her hair braided in the native way, her dress stitched from cloth common among settlers. She raised a hand, a gesture of peace. "My name is Maya," she said, her voice low but steady. "I was sent to speak with you." Luke's eyes narrowed. "Sent by who?" She hesitated before answering. "By Taza." The name struck him like a spark. He gestured for her to come forward, though his hand stayed near his revolver. She stepped onto the porch, her movements calm, her eyes sharp with intelligence. "They know what you did," Maya said. "They know you gave your horse. They know you faced the soldiers." Luke studied her in silence. "They also know the soldiers will not stop," she continued. "Taza asked that you come. There are things you must understand." Luke shook his head slightly. "And if I don't?" Maya's gaze didn't waver. "Then you will be hunted, not for what you've done, but for what they believe you carry. The choice is yours, but the desert has already marked you." Her words carried the same weight as the silent riders, as Nakai's single sentence, as the officer's warning. Luke felt the invisible thread tightening further, drawing him into a story he hadn't chosen, but could no longer walk away from. After a long pause, he nodded once. "Then show me." Maya's lips pressed into a thin line. Not quite relief, not quite satisfaction. She turned toward the horizon, where the moonlight cast silver shadows across the land. "We ride at dawn." And just like that, she melted back into the night, leaving Luke alone once more with the questions that clawed at his thoughts. Questions without answers, circling endlessly like vultures waiting for the desert to decide what to claim. He knew one thing for certain. The soldiers would return, and when they did, his choices would matter more than his silence. The first gray light of morning had only just touched the horizon when Luke Carver saddled his horse. Maya was already waiting by the gate, mounted on a small bay mare that shifted restlessly beneath her. Her posture was confident, her gaze fixed on the desert beyond as though she had no doubts about the path they were about to follow. Luke, however, carried a heaviness in his chest. He had lived his whole life avoiding entanglements, and now he was being drawn deeper into something that felt older than himself. They rode in silence for several miles, the desert waking around them with the calls of hawks and the rustle of jackrabbits darting through dry brush. Luke's eyes kept sweeping the horizon, wary of dust clouds that might signal soldiers, but the land remained empty. Finally, when the sun had begun to rise in earnest, Maya spoke. "You wonder why they chose you." Luke glanced at her. "I didn't ask to be chosen." "No one ever does," she said, her voice calm, almost distant. "But the desert doesn't care about what you ask. It cares about what you carry." He let the words settle between them, but they offered no clarity. They pressed on, the sun climbing higher, the heat settling on their shoulders. After hours of riding, Maya led him into a canyon carved deep into the land, its walls streaked with red and gold. The air grew cooler there, the sound of the open desert muffled by stone. Luke felt the shift immediately. This was not a place of chance. It was deliberate. At the far end of the canyon, hidden beneath an outcropping of rock, they dismounted. Maya gestured for him to follow as she slipped between two jagged stones into a narrow passage. Luke ducked low, the walls pressing close, until the space widened into a hollow shelter from the sky. The ground was smoothed by time, the walls etched with markings that glimmered faintly in the filtered light. Maya knelt before one of the carvings, her fingers brushing the stone. These were cut by my mother's people generations ago. They mark a promise made between the Apache and men who came before the soldiers, before the railroads. Some promises are written on paper, others are written in the earth. Luke studied the carvings. He could not understand their meaning, but he felt the weight in them, the sense of something sacred. Why bring me here? Because you are tied to it, Maya said. More than you know. She reached into a pouch at her side and withdrew a small bundle wrapped in hide. She placed it in Luke's hands. Inside lay a necklace almost identical to the one he had found at his gate, but older, the beads worn smooth, the feathers brittle with age. Alongside it rested a fragment of parchment, yellowed and fragile, with words scrawled in faded ink. Luke squinted, recognizing English letters though much of it was illegible. What remained was enough to strike him. In agreement with Taza, lands to remain sacred until river runs dry. His heart hammered. The name again. Taza. He lifted his eyes to Maya. My father's people knew your father, she said softly. There was a pact made long before you carried his name. That is why you were not abandoned when you gave your horse. They see your blood, not only your actions. Luke's mind reeled. He thought back to the few scraps of memory he had of his father. A man of quiet strength, more shadow than substance in Luke's recollection. He had never heard of pacts, never heard of Apache names whispered in connection to his family. And yet, here was proof laid in his hands. Maya stood, her eyes steady. The soldier searched for Nakai because he carries more than a wound. He carries the knowledge of these agreements. If they kill him, they erase not just a man, but the memory of what was promised. That is why Taza sent the warriors. That is why you were spared. You have become part of this, whether you choose it or not. Luke closed the hide bundle carefully, his hands trembling despite himself. The canyon seemed to press in around him, the carvings on the walls watching, listening. He felt as though he had stumbled into a story far older than he believed possible, one in which his own name had been written long before he ever drew breath. The sound of a hawk's cry cut through the air. Maya tilted her head, listening, then tensed. We shouldn't stay longer. There are eyes in this land that do not belong to us. They retraced their steps quickly, mounting their horses, and riding hard until they left the canyon behind. The open desert felt harsher now, the sun glaring down with merciless heat. Luke kept glancing back, half expecting riders to emerge in the stone shadows. By the time they reached his ranch again, the day was fading. Maya dismounted, her expression solemn. Keep what I've given you safe. You'll understand more soon. But for now, you must be careful. The soldiers are not blind, only patient. Luke nodded, though his thoughts were a storm. He carried the bundle inside, placing it next to the necklace and knife already hidden. His small cabin felt heavier now, as if the weight of history itself had been laid across its beams. That night, he sat awake long after the lantern had burned low, the parchment's words repeating in his mind. In agreement with Taza, lands will remain sacred, until river runs dry. His father's silence over the years now seemed less like neglect and more like burden. What else had the man hidden? What truths had died with him? The wind outside shifted, rattling the shutters, carrying with it the scent of distant rain. Luke sat at the table, his revolver within reach, the bundle before him. He realized he no longer feared the soldier's return. What unsettled him most now was the truth pressing closer, the ancient secret rising from the earth beneath his boots. And though he did not yet know it, by keeping that secret on his land, Luke Carver had already stepped into a role that could not be undone. The storm that had threatened the desert all night broke just before dawn, drenching the land in a rare but violent rain. Luke Carver lay awake, listening to the drumming on the roof of his cabin, the water rushing in rivulets down the hardened earth outside. His thoughts had been circling endlessly since Maya's revelation in the canyon. The faded parchment, the carved promises, the echo of his father's name linked to a people he had never truly known. the more he tried to reason through it. The heavier it sat on his chest, as if the desert itself had taken hold of him. By the time the rain stopped and the sun broke through the clouds, steam rising from the soaked ground, Luke saddled his horse. He needed motion, something to burn through the tension that had settled in his bones. He rode out to check the far fence line, though it didn't take long before he realized he wasn't alone. A figure stood near the edge of his pasture, waiting with the calm patience of someone who knew they would not be ignored. Maya. She hadn't come with the subtlety of the night before. This time she was in plain sight, her bay mare tethered to a mesquite tree, her posture straight and her gaze fixed on Luke as he approached. "You came back," Luke said, pulling his horse to a stop. "I told you there would be more," Maya replied. Her tone was quiet, but carried the certainty of someone who bore the weight of a message. Luke dismounted, brushing rain from his hat. "Then speak plain. What is it they want from me now?" Maya stepped closer, her eyes never leaving his. "Not they. Nakai." Luke stiffened. The name carried more now than it had before. No longer just a wounded man in the rocks, but a thread tied to promises carved into stone, promises bound to his father's shadow. "He's alive." Maya nodded. "Alive and healing, but he cannot stay in the open. The soldiers hunt him harder each day. They call him fugitive, but what he carries is more dangerous than his body." Luke's eyes narrowed. "And what does he want with me?" Maya's hand moved to her satchel. She drew out a small, heavy object wrapped in cloth. She unwrapped it just enough for Luke to glimpse the dark iron edges of a box no larger than a man's hand. Its surface was scratched, the lock rusted but intact. She held it out, her voice low. "He asked you to keep this, to bury it on your land, where no soldier will think to look." Luke did not take it immediately. The weight of the box seemed to radiate from her hands. Not physical, but something else. Something that pressed into the air around them. "What's inside?" he asked. Maya shook her head. "I don't know. I don't ask. But I know this. If the soldiers find it, they will use it to break everything that still holds. If you hide it, Nakai will trust that his people's fight will last longer than his own life." Luke stared at the box, the questions clawing at his mind. He had already risked himself by standing between Nakai and soldiers once. He had already been marked by their suspicion. To hide something from them now would be more than defiance. It would be a declaration. "Why me?" he asked finally. "Because you already carry his debt," Maya said simply. "Because when 70 came, they did not take your life. They gave it back. And because of what your father was, whether you knew it or not." The desert wind stirred between them, carrying the damp scent of rain-soaked earth. Luke's jaw clenched. He reached out, taking the box. It was colder than he expected, its weight heavy in his palm. He wrapped it again in the cloth and tucked it beneath his coat. "I'll keep it," he said, his voice steady though his chest felt tight. "But I won't bury it where I can't reach it. If trouble comes, I'll need to know where it lies." Maya inclined her head, a gesture that was neither approval nor doubt, simply acknowledgement. "Do what you must. Just don't let it fall into the wrong hands." They stood in silence for a long moment before she mounted her mare again. "I will come back when it is time," she said. Then she turned her horse and rode off across the damp desert, her figure soon swallowed by the horizon. Luke remained still, the weight of the box burning against his chest. He felt the same unease he had felt in the canyon, the same invisible pull of something greater than himself. With a heavy breath, he swung back onto his horse and rode toward the barn. That night, under cover of darkness, he carried the box into the barn and pried up the wooden planks of the floor. The cattle shifted restlessly outside as he dug into the hard earth with a shovel, the scrape of metal against stone loud in the silence. He lowered the box into the shallow pit and covered it carefully, tamping the soil back into place before replacing the boards. He stood there for a long time, lantern casting shadows across the barn walls, listening to his own heartbeat thudding like a drum. When he finally returned to the cabin, the air felt heavier, as though the land itself knew what it had just done. He tried to sleep, but every creak of wood, every groan of wind outside seemed sharper, more threatening. He dreamed of soldiers tearing through his barn, of hands pulling the box from the ground, of flames consuming his land. He woke before dawn, drenched in sweat, his revolver already in his hand. The day that followed gave no peace. Men came to the ranch. This time not soldiers, but townsfolk, rough men armed with rifles who claimed they were acting in the name of the law. Their leader, a bearded man with a scar across his cheek, demanded entry. "We've had reports of stolen property passing through here," he said with a sneer. Luke's blood ran cold, though his face showed nothing. "You've heard wrong." They pushed past him anyway, storming through the cabin, shoving furniture, scattering his belongings. Luke stood firm, hand never straying far from his revolver, but he counted their guns. Too many to win if Lee began to fly. The men tore through his home and barn, overturning hay bales, splitting wood, even ripping at the floorboards. Luke's chest tightened with each strike, but by some stroke of fortune, they missed the exact place where the earth had been disturbed. After nearly an hour of wreckage, they left with curses and threats. "Next time, Carver," the scarred man spat. "Next time we'll bring fire." When the dust of their departure settled, Luke stood in the ruins of his cabin, breathing hard. His hands shook not with fear, but with the knowledge of how close they had come. The box lay safer now, but the margin between survival and ruin had narrowed to a hair's breadth. He sat at the table, staring at the broken chair, the spilled flour across the floor, the shards of a lantern kicked aside. Questions circled his mind. Who was Nakai truly? What power did that box hold? And why had his father's name been tied to all of this long, before Luke had chosen a path? The desert gave no answers. It only held the silence, heavy and watchful, waiting for the next move. The morning after the armed townsmen stormed through his ranch, Luke Carver moved like a man caught between two worlds. The air was sharp with the smell of dust disturbed by too many boots, and every broken chair, every scattered item in his cabin, was a reminder of how close they had come to uncovering what he had buried in the barn. He set about putting his house back in order, though his movements were slow, thoughtful, heavy with the knowledge that order could never truly return. He replaced the planks in the barn with extra care, his hands lingering on the boards as if feeling for a pulse beneath them. The box lay safe in the earth, but Luke could not shake the sensation that it radiated outward, an invisible beacon calling danger closer each day. He had buried more than an object. He had buried a secret that seemed to have its own gravity. That afternoon, as the sun burned high, Luke saddled his horse and rode into town for supplies. He needed nails, kerosene, and flour, practical things to mend the damage and keep him alive. But as he tied his horse outside the general store, he noticed how eyes followed him, conversation still when he walked past. Some men leaned together, whispering. Others looked away too quickly. The storm at his ranch had not gone unnoticed. Inside the store, old Mr. Hardy weighed sugar and beans with a kind of distracted unease. "Heard there was trouble out your way," he muttered, not meeting Luke's eyes. "Men acting like they carry the law when they don't," Luke answered flatly. Hardy gave a dry laugh, shaking his head. "Out here, law's just another word for whoever's got the rifles. Best keep your head down, Carver." Luke paid without further talk, loading his supplies carefully before riding back out. But the weight of those watchful eyes lingered on him all the way home. By the time the desert opened wide around him again, he knew his isolation had been pierced. People were paying attention now, and not the kind who cared for truth. That night, Luke sat at his table, lantern casting its weak glow across the wood. He spread out the parchment Maya had given him, reading and rereading the faded words until his eyes blurred. In agreement with Taza, lands that remain sacred, it circled his mind like a prayer half forgotten. His father's shadow seemed to fill the room, heavy and silent. Why had the old man never spoken of this? Why had Luke inherited land bound to promises he didn't understand? He was still lost in thought when a sharp knock broke the silence. Luke's hand went instantly to his revolver. He moved to the door, cracking it open just enough to see a figure standing in the moonlight. It was Maya. "You shouldn't be here," Luke said, though he stepped aside to let her in. She entered quickly, her eyes scanning the room as if expecting soldiers to burst in at any moment. "They are closing in," she said. "The soldiers, the ones who came to your land. They are not only searching for Nakai. They believe there is something hidden here, something they've been ordered to find." Luke's voice was grim. They nearly tore my house apart looking. Maya met his gaze. And they will return. But the longer the box stays buried here, the more danger you carry. Luke stiffened. Then what do you suggest? I hand it over? Let them burn through the last thing holding your people's claim? Her expression softened, though her voice remained firm. No, I suggest you hold steady. Nakai trusts you. He believes your land is safer than the hills, safer even than the warriors who guard him. That box carries what the soldiers fear most. Proof. Words and seals that no bullet can erase. Luke stared at her. Proof of what? Maya hesitated, then answered. Of promises your father stood witness to. Promises that tie you to us more than you realize. The cabin seemed to shrink around them, the weight of her words pressing down like stone. Luke looked at the floorboards, imagining the box lying beneath the earth in his barn. It felt less like an object and more like a loaded weapon. Only its trigger was history itself. Before he could reply, Maya placed something small on the table between them. It was a folded piece of cloth, inside of which rested a beadwork medallion. Nakai asked me to give you this, she said. A sign that his trust is not one-sided. If you fall, 70 will not forget. Luke picked up the medallion. The beads shimmered in the lamplight, each color threaded with careful precision. He felt its weight as more than ornament. It was a promise, a bond. They spoke little more that night. Maya left before dawn, vanishing back into the desert like a shadow swallowed by the rising sun. Luke watched her go, the medallion clutched tight in his hand. 2 days later, the danger returned. This time it wasn't the army in blue coats, but the same armed civilians who had come before. They rode hard into his yard at midday, their horses lathered with sweat, their rifles already in their hands. The Scar Man led them, his sneer sharper than ever. We've had word, he barked, that you're harboring Apache secrets on this land. If you think you can hide from the government, you're a bigger fool than I thought. Luke stood on his porch, revolver at his side, but not raised. You've already searched my house and barn. You found nothing. The man grinned, a cruel stretch of lips. Last time we were looking for one thing. This time we'll burn it down if we have to. The men dismounted, fanning out. Luke felt the noose tightening, the inevitability of their violence. He had no chance alone. His hand tensed on his revolver, his body poised to fight. He knew he couldn't win. Then it came, the sound that froze every man in the yard. Hooves. Not a handful this time, but many, a deep, steady thunder rising from beyond the ridge. The scarred man turned, his grin faltering. Dust rose in the distance, and within it, the silhouettes of riders, Apache, dozens of them, their movement disciplined and silent. Luke's heart hammered. The 70 had returned. The armed men cursed, some fumbling for their rifles, others backing toward their horses. The scarred man spat on the ground, but his bravado faltered. This isn't over, Carver, he growled before mounting up. His men followed, retreating fast, unwilling to test their courage against 70 warriors. Luke stood frozen as the Apache column approached, their faces grave, their silence heavier than any war cry. They did not charge, did not threaten. They encircled the ranch in solemn stillness, watching from their ranks. The old warrior, Taza, rode forward, his presence commanding. He dismounted, walked to Luke, and laid a hand briefly on his shoulder. No words were spoken, but the meaning was clear. The box was not just hidden now. It was guarded. And Luke Carver understood, as the warriors settled like sentinels around his land, that what he had buried was more than iron and parchment. It was the core of a struggle older than him, older even than his father. It was the heart of the desert itself, and now it lay in his keeping. The 70 warriors did not remain long around Luke Carver's land. They came like a storm, silent but overwhelming, and then they vanished again, leaving only the trampled earth and the echo of their presence behind. But their brief vigil had changed everything. Word spread quickly through the nearest towns, whispered in saloons and traded at campfires. Carver's ranch had been circled by Apaches, and instead of leaving him dead in the dirt, they had left him standing. Suspicion deepened. Men who once tipped their hats when passing Luke in town now crossed to the other side of the street. Women drew their children closer, as if a shadow carried danger. Yet, not everyone avoided him. Some watched him with a strange mix of fear and curiosity, as though wondering what unseen pact held his life in place. Luke carried the weight of it quietly. He worked his land, mended his fences, rode the boundaries of his pasture, but all the while the box beneath the barn seemed to throb like a buried heart. Every day he expected the soldiers to return, or the scarred civilians, or worse. Each dawn felt borrowed. It was during one of those restless mornings that Luke found himself digging through an old trunk that had belonged to his mother. He hadn't opened it since her death years earlier, but something gnawed at him, a sense that answers might lie closer than he thought. The trunk creaked as he lifted the lid, the smell of cedar and dust rising like a ghost. Inside were the simple relics of quiet life: quilts, faded dresses, a silver hairbrush, and stacks of letters tied with string. Luke sifted through them slowly, his hands rough against the delicate paper. Most were ordinary correspondence, his mother writing to a cousin back east about the loneliness of the frontier, the relentless dust, the sickness that had claimed neighbors. But near the bottom he found a smaller bundle, wrapped separately, the ink more faded, the handwriting unfamiliar. He untied the string, unfolding one letter at random. His eyes scanned the words, and his breath caught. "Your father has made a pact with men who do not speak our tongue. He says it is for the railroad, for the cattle trails, for peace. But he comes home with blood on his boots and silence in his mouth." Luke's hands trembled as he read on. Another letter spoke of nights when his father would disappear into the desert, returning with strange tokens: beads, feathers, a knife with carvings his mother did not understand. She had hidden them, fearing what neighbors might say. And then he saw it, the name written in his mother's neat hand: Taza. Luke sat back hard, the letter slipping from his fingers. The room seemed smaller, darker. His father had known Taza, the same Taza who had stood before Luke only days ago, older now but unmistakable. The realization rippled through him like a shock. This was no accident, no random twist of fate. His father had stood in the same place he now stood, bound by the same invisible thread. He searched the letters until the sun had climbed high. One described his father standing with a group of Apache men beside the river, cutting his palm with a knife and pressing his blood into theirs. A pact of flesh and earth, sworn before the railroad came. Another spoke of his father telling her, in rare moments of honesty, that if their son ever inherited the land, he too would inherit its promises. Luke pressed his palms against the table. They would cool beneath his skin. His mother had known all along, and she had kept a secret, perhaps hoping it would die with her. But secrets buried in this desert never stayed buried. They surfaced like bones in dry earth, demanding to be reckoned with. The sound of hooves broke his thoughts. Luke rose, hand-goaded his revolver. But when he stepped outside, he saw only a single rider approaching. It was not Maya this time, nor soldiers. It was Earl Whitman, his neighbor, the man who had warned him once already. Earl's face was drawn tight, his eyes sharp beneath the brim of his hat. "You've been digging into things best left alone," Earl said as he reined in near the porch. Luke frowned. "How would you know?" "Because your father wasn't the only one there that day," Earl replied. "I was a boy, but I remember. I saw him ride with Taza. Saw the blood, oath with my own eyes. Folks talk about him like he was just another rancher, but some of us know different." Luke studied him, suspicion and curiosity wrestling inside him. "And why tell me this now?" "Because you're walking the same trail," Earl said grimly. "And trails like that don't end in peace. They end in graves. Maybe you think you're honoring him, or maybe you just don't know how to walk away. But listen to me, Carver. Those promises your father made, they weren't just words. They're chains. They'll bind you tighter than any rope the army can throw around your neck." Luke's jaw tightened. Maybe chains are better than turning my back on what's right. Earl's eyes hardened. That's what he thought, too. He pulled his reins, turning his horse. Just remember where it left him. The word struck like a stone in Luke's chest. He watched Earl ride off, dust rising in his wake, and he felt the desert close in tighter around him. His father's silence was no longer just a mystery. It was a warning, written in the blood that still ran in Luke's veins. That night, unable to rest, Luke returned to the barn. He lit a lantern and pried up the boards once more, staring at the packed earth where the box lay hidden. He didn't dig it up. He didn't need to. Just knowing it was there, tied now not only to Nakai and Taza but to his own father, was enough to keep him rooted in place. Above, the desert sky stretched endless, stars burning with ancient light. Luke stood alone in a barn, lantern flickering, the whispers of forgotten connections crowding around him. He had thought himself a man apart, a loner without ties. Now he knew better. His blood carried history, and history was calling. The days that followed Earl Whitman's warning carried the uneasy quiet that often comes before a storm. Luke Carver worked his land as he always had, but every sound on the horizon drew his attention. Every gust of wind stirring dust across the ridges made his hand tighten on the revolver at his hip. The letters from his mother and the truth about his father lay heavy in his thoughts. The pact was no longer a shadowed rumor. It was a fact carved into his family's blood. The Apache did not appear again, not even Maya, but their absence was louder than their presence had ever been. Luke sensed it. The waiting was ending. It was late afternoon when the first signs came. A single rider crested the ridge to the south, silhouetted against the glare of the sun. Luke watched from the porch, his heart tightening. The rider didn't approach. He simply lingered, watching the ranch for a long moment before turning back the way he'd come. A scout. Luke knew enough about soldiers to recognize the pattern. They would return, and not in small number. He spent that night preparing. He patched holes in the barn wall, checked the barrels of his rifles, and filled every canteen he owned. His cattle sensed his unease, restless in the corral. By dawn, dust rose again on the horizon, only this time it did not vanish. A column of soldiers advanced, deliberate and unhurried, their banners snapping in the wind, their wagons rattling behind them. This was not a patrol. This was an occupation. Luke's stomach turned cold as he counted them. More than 50 men, with rifles, sabers, and cannons strapped to the wagons. The officer at their head sat tall in his saddle, his uniform sharp despite the dust, his face set in grim determination. This was no lean lieutenant sent to question a cowboy. This was command. The column halted within sight of the ranch, their lines spreading wide. A rider detached from the group and approached under a white cloth raised on a stick. He stopped at Luke's gate, his voice carrying across the yard. "Luke Carver, by authority of the United States Army, you are ordered to vacate this land immediately. It has been determined that your property lies within territory of federal interest. Refusal to comply will be treated as an act of resistance." Luke stepped forward, his hand steady though his blood pounded in his ears. "This is my land, my father's land before me. You've no right to take it." The officer's face remained cold. "Your father's dealings with the Apache are known. His pacts are void, his claims illegitimate. Stand down or we'll remove you by force." Luke said nothing more. He turned and walked back into his cabin, closing the door with deliberate calm. Inside, the air was thick, heavy with the smell of kerosene from the lamp. He sat at the table, resting his hands against the wood, listening to the faint clatter of equipment as the soldiers set their lines outside. Dusk fell slowly, the sky painted in shades of crimson and violet. Luke lit his last lamplight. Knowing it could well be the final night, he sat in his cabin. He checked the rifle leaning by the door, the revolver at his side. His breath slowed, his body settling into the steady readiness of a man resigned. Then he heard it, the distant thunder of hooves. He rose and stepped to the window, pushing the curtain aside. Beyond the soldiers' campfires, dust rose on the northern horizon. Shapes formed within it, moving in unison, disciplined and relentless. The sound grew louder, deeper, until the soldiers themselves turned in alarm. Luke's throat tightened. He knew that sound. 70 riders crested the ridge, their silhouettes black against the burning sky. Apache warriors, riding with the same silent authority as before, their ponies surging forward in perfect rhythm. They did not cry out. They did not raise weapons. They simply came, and their presence was heavier than the army's banners, heavier than the cannon's iron. The soldiers scrambled into formation, rifles raised, the officers shouting orders. But the warriors did not attack. They surrounded the ranch in a wide circle, their faces solemn, their silence cutting sharper than any shout. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. Luke stepped out onto his porch, the lamplight flickering behind him. His eyes swept the scene. The soldiers bristling with fear and discipline, the Apaches calm and unmoving. At the head of the riders, Taza dismounted, his figure tall and unwavering as he walked forward. The soldiers shifted nervously, rifles aimed, but he ignored them, his eyes fixed only on Luke. Without a word, Taza stopped at the base of the porch. For a long moment, the two men regarded one another, the weight of generations pressing between them. Then Taza extended his hand, palm upward, not in greeting, but in demand. Luke understood. He turned and went into the barn. The boards came up easily under his hands, the packed earth giving way. The box lay there cold and heavy, its presence undeniable. He lifted it, the iron edges rough against his palms, and carried it outside. The soldiers shouted, some raising rifles, but the officer barked for them to hold. All eyes followed as Luke crossed the yard, the box clutched to his chest. He stopped before Taza and placed it into the old warrior's hands. The air seemed to shift. Taza opened the box, the iron hinges creaking. Within lay folded documents, their seals cracked but still visible, their ink faded but legible. Luke caught glimpses as Taza lifted them. Signatures, official stamps, words written in English and Apache alike. They were not trinkets, not treasure. They were proof. Promises bound in law as well as blood. The officer's face darkened as he realized what he saw. He spurred his horse forward, demanding the documents. But Taza held him high, his voice finally breaking the silence in a tongue Luke only half understood. The warriors around him echoed his cry, their voices rising like the wind itself, carrying the weight of generations. The soldiers faltered, their rifles lowering despite the officer's shouted orders. The proof in Taza's hands was heavier than bullets. It was legitimacy, undeniable even in the eyes of Washington. To fire now would not be victory. It would be murder, witnessed by 70 who would not forget, and a cowboy who had nothing left to lose. Luke stood silent, the desert wind whipping his coat, the firelight casting long shadows across his land. The siege had come, but it was not ending with cannon fire or blood. It was ending with the truth laid bare, held aloft by men who had carried it too long in silence. The officer pulled his reins hard, his jaw clenched, his eyes burning with frustration, but he gave no order to fire. He turned his horse sharply, signaling his men. One by one, the soldiers lowered their rifles. The standoff broke like a storm passing, tension draining into the cooling night. Luke exhaled slowly, his body trembling only now that the moment had passed. He looked at Taza, who still held the documents aloft, his face grave but unyielding. The old warrior lowered them at last, meeting Luke's eyes. No words were spoken, but Luke understood. The land was not as alone anymore. It never had been. The night after the standoff was unnaturally still. The soldiers had withdrawn to the south, their campfires shrinking to distant embers before finally vanishing beyond the horizon. Yet Luke Carver did not feel relief. The air was charged, tense, as if the desert itself held its breath. The 70 Apache warriors had not left. They lingered in silence, their presence like an unspoken wall between Luke's ranch and the world beyond. Taza sat apart from the others, cross-legged by a low fire near the corral, the iron box beside him. The old warrior had not opened it further since raising the papers before the soldiers, but the weight of it seemed to hold him still, as though it demanded not only strength of arms, but also strength of spirit. Luke watched from his porch, uncertain whether to approach. His land had never been so full of life, and yet he felt like a guest in his own home. At last, Taza lifted his head and beckoned him. Luke walked across the yard, the crunch of dry earth loud in the silence. The fire cast Taza's features in deep lines, his eyes sharp but not unkind. He gestured to the box. "You kept it," Taza said, his English halting but clear. Luke nodded. "I didn't know what it was. Not until tonight." Taza's gaze lingered on him for a long moment. Then, with slow care, he opened the box again. One by one, he removed the folded papers, setting them carefully on a cloth spread across the ground. The firelight flickered against the faded ink and cracked seals. Luke crouched beside him, his eyes scanning the documents. The first was dated decades earlier, bearing the seal of the territorial governor. It recognized the Apache's right to land in the valley north of the river, declaring its sacred ground not to be seized or sold. Another was a treaty signed by military officers, promising safe passage and protection in exchange for peace. A third, more fragile, carried the names of both Apache leaders and white settlers, bound together in ink that had nearly faded into the parchment. And then there was one more, a single sheet, simpler than the rest, its words blunt and unmistakable. It was signed in Luke's father's name. Luke's throat tightened as he read the handwriting. His father had sworn to protect the land, to honor the Apache's right to live and hunt freely, to keep the agreement alive as long as my bloodline endures. It was not just a witness's signature. It was a pledge, binding his family to theirs. Taza tapped the page with a weathered finger. "Your father stood here," he said. He cut his hand with the knife. His blood mixed with mine. His words tied to my words. "You carry him." Luke swallowed hard, the truth pressing heavy in his chest. He had spent his life believing his father a quiet rancher, a man who kept his silence out of habit. Now he saw that silence for what it was, a shield, a burden too heavy to explain to a child. "Why hide it?" Luke asked, his voice rough. "Why bury these papers?" Taz's eyes flicked toward the horizon where the soldiers had disappeared. "Because paper burns. Soldiers burn what they cannot control. Better hidden than destroyed. But Nakai found them again, and they must live in the open now. The time of hiding is over." Luke stared at the documents spread before him. They were fragile, old, and yet more powerful than rifles or cannons. Proof, as Maya had said, that promises had been made and broken. Proof that his father's hand had been part of something greater than himself. Taza gathered the papers carefully, placing them back in the box. "These belong not to me, not to you, but to both. Your land, our blood. If the army comes again, we show them the courts of their own people. They cannot deny what their own men wrote." Luke frowned. "And if they try anyway?" Taza's face was stone. "Then 70 ride again, and 70 more after that." For the first time, Luke felt the full force of what had been placed upon him. He was not merely a man caught in the middle. He was a hinge on which two worlds now turned, the keeper proof, the heir of a pact. His choice could mean the survival or the erasure of a people's claim. The fire burned low, the night stretching long. Luke remained beside Taza until silence settled again, then returned to his cabin. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling beams, the words of his father's pledge echoing in his mind. "As long as my bloodline endures." At dawn, the warriors began to move. Some broke camp, scouting the ridges, while others remained near the corral. Luke walked to the barn to check on his cattle and found Maya waiting for him. She looked tired, her eyes shadowed but bright with determination. "You've seen what was inside," she said. "I've seen," Luke replied. "And now you understand why they hunt Nakai. Not for himself, but for what he carries. These papers were meant to die with time. He chose to bring them back. Now they must live in the open, or they will be buried forever." Luke studied her. "You mean to take them to the courts?" She nodded. "With you? Alone, we cannot speak their language. Alone, they will not listen. But with you, your name, your father's name, they cannot ignore it." The thought struck Luke like a hammer. He had spent his life avoiding the world beyond his fences, and now he was being asked to step into his heart, carrying a burden older than himself. He wanted to refuse, to return to his solitude, but the desert had already chosen otherwise. He looked past Maya to the horizon, where the sun was rising in a blaze of red and gold. "Then we ride," he said quietly. Maya's eyes softened, though her shoulders remained firm. "We ride soon, but be ready. The army will not let us pass without trying to silence us first." Luke nodded, the weight of the decision settling like iron in his bones. He turned back toward the cabin. The medallion Nakai had given him hanging at his neck, the document safe in Taza's keeping. He was no longer a bystander. He was a bridge, the bloodline, the man his father had prepared without words. And as the sun rose higher, Luke knew the fight was far from over. The box had been opened, and what it carried could not be buried again. The decision to ride into town with the documents weighed heavier on Luke Carver than any rifle he had ever carried. The morning was pale and windless, the kind of day when sound carried far across the desert. The Apache warriors broke their camp quietly, their movements disciplined, their ponies shifting restlessly as if sensing the danger ahead. Taza placed the iron box into a leather satchel, strapping across his chest with care. His face was set in stone, but Luke could see the tension the way his hands lingered a moment too long on the straps. Maya approached Luke as he tightened the cinch on his horse. "When we ride into town," she said, "eyes will be on you, not on Taza, not on me. They will hear your voice before ours. Do you understand?" Luke nodded, though the thought unsettled him. He had spent his life avoiding attention, keeping to the quiet rhythms of ranch work. Now the silence he had always clung to was breaking. He would have to speak in the open, and not only speak, but stand firm against men who wanted nothing more than to see him silenced. They rode as the sun climbed higher, casting heat across the sand. The 70 warriors flanked them, not as an army preparing for battle, but as a shield. Their silence carried as much weight as their numbers. By the time they reached the town, dust swirled around them, the sound of hooves drawing every face from doorways and windows. The townsfolk froze as the column entered. Mothers pulled children back, merchants shut their shutters with shaking hands, and men who might have boasted bravado in saloons now kept their rifles lowered. No one dared move against the sight of 70 Apache riding at the side of a lone cowboy. Luke dismounted first, his boots striking the wooden planks of the courthouse steps. Taza followed, lifting the satchel with the documents. Together, they entered the building, Maya close behind. Inside, the air was stifling, the murmurs of gathered townsfolk and officials buzzing like flies. At the far end of the room, a federal judge sat elevated on the bench, his black coat dusted from travel, his expression stern. Soldiers lined the walls, their rifles gleaming under the dim light. The judge's eyes narrowed as he looked over the unusual procession. "Mr. Carver," he said, his voice echoing, "you stand here accused of aiding fugitives, obstructing federal officers, and harboring hostile Apache on your property. Do you deny these charges?" Luke felt the weight of every gaze pressing on him. He drew in a slow breath. "I deny nothing," he said firmly. "I gave a wounded man my horse. I stood between him and your soldiers because I would not see him dragged to his death. And I kept safe what your men would have destroyed, because it belongs not just to them, but to this land and to history itself." A ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd. The judge leaned forward. "You speak boldly, Carver, but words alone will not save you. Do you have proof of these claims?" Luke glanced at Taza, who stepped forward. With deliberate calm, the old warrior opened the satchel and drew out the papers. He laid them on the judge's bench, his hands steady. "These," Luke said, "are treaties, agreements signed by governors, officers, and settlers. Promises that this land was sacred, promises that my father stood witness to with his own blood. They have been buried, hidden, nearly erased, but they exist, and they bind us still." The judge's eyes flicked over the documents. His hands trembled slightly as he traced the faded signatures. The seals pressed into the parchment. Whispers filled the room, sharp and urgent. A soldier stepped forward, demanding the papers be seized, but the judge raised a hand, silencing him. "These are genuine," the judge said slowly, his voice carrying weight, "signed by recognized authorities. If this evidence stands, then the government is bound to honor them. To ignore this would be to break its own word." The officer bristled, his face dark with anger. "These savages have killed our men, raided our lands. You would let Old Ink excuse them." Luke stepped forward, his voice sharp. "Old Ink? These are not excuses. They are promises. Promises your men broke. Promises my father bled for. Promises that still stand whether you respect them or not." The room fell into silence. The weight of his words hung heavy, undeniable. For the first time, Luke did not feel like a loner on the edges of the desert. He felt like a voice carrying the burden of two worlds. The judge rose, his gavel striking the bench once. Until this matter is examined fully in higher courts, these documents stand as valid. This land remains protected. The Apache have rightful claim. Shouts erupted from the crowd, anger, disbelief, some even cheers. But Luke barely heard them, and his heart pounded, his chest tight with the enormity of what had just been done. He looked at Taza, who inclined his head slightly, an acknowledgment deeper than any words. As they stepped out of the courthouse, the sun struck them full in the face. The Apache warriors outside raised their heads, their silence breaking in low chants that carried across the square. The soldiers who had shadowed them now looked uncertain, their authority undercut by the judge's ruling. Maya touched Luke's arm gently. You spoke, and they heard. Do you see now why it had to be you? Luke's voice was quiet, but steady. I see, but this isn't the end. They'll fight this ruling. They won't let it stand. Taza's deep voice cut through. Then we stand longer, with you or without you, but we stand. Luke looked out across the square, the town divided between fear and awe, between those who saw him as traitor and those who saw him as something else entirely. He had not sought this role, but it had found him. That night, back at his ranch, Luke sat alone on the porch. The warriors had withdrawn to their camps. The town had fallen into uneasy quiet, and the documents were secured under guard. The stars stretched endless above him, the desert breathing its ancient rhythm. He spoke aloud, though no one was there to hear. Father, I kept it. I did what you could not say. His words carried into the night, swallowed by the vastness of the land. It was his last word, not of resignation, but of acceptance. He could no longer be just a cowboy on the edge of silence. He was a bearer of a promise older than himself, and though the battles ahead would be fierce, his voice would not falter again. Weeks passed, and the dust of the courthouse ruling did not settle. The town lived in a state of tension, caught between fear of the army's reprisal and the quiet power of the proof that had been unveiled. Luke Carver felt it each time he rode in for supplies. The wary eyes, the whispers that followed him. Some called him traitor. Others called him fool. A few, though very few, tipped their hats with the cautious respect reserved for a man who had done what no one else dared. The Apache warriors had withdrawn, not vanishing into the desert, but holding their camps in the distance, close enough to remind everyone they remained. The presence of 70 men had become a myth in itself, told around firelight with voices lowered, as if speaking too loudly might summon them again. The army did not return, at least not yet. They licked their wounds elsewhere, regrouping, perhaps plotting to come back with greater force. Luke knew it was only a matter of time. One late afternoon, when the air was heavy with heat and the sky streaked with the haze of summer dust, Maya returned to the ranch. She dismounted at the gate, carrying in her hands a small leather-bound book. Her expression was softer than usual, touched with something Luke had not seen before, hesitation. This was given to me, she said quietly, offering the book. It belonged to an Apache warrior, long ago. He fought beside Taza when your father was young. It was passed down, kept hidden, and now it has found its way back. It speaks of your family. Luke took the book carefully, the leather worn smooth, the pages fragile with age. He opened it slowly, his eyes scanning the careful handwriting. The words were a mix of Apache and English, recorded by a man who had lived between both worlds. He read in silence at first, but the further he went, the tighter his chest became. It told of a night decades earlier, when settlers and Apache had nearly come to blood under the shadow of the new railroad. It told a betrayal avoided only because a white rancher, his father, had stepped into fire with nothing but trust in his hands. He had pulled Taza, then barely more than a boy, from the edge of death when violence had broken loose. He had carried him back, tended his wounds, and in doing so earned something more permanent than gratitude. The book's pages spoke plainly. We gave him our word. If ever his blood called out, we would answer, 70 strong, until the debt was closed. Luke lowered the book, his hands trembling slightly. He looked at Maya, his voice low. So that's why they came. Not just for Nakai, not just for the papers. For him, for my father. Maya nodded. And for you, because when the chance came, you chose as he did. You gave what you could not spare. That is why they returned. Luke closed the book, staring out across the land. His father's silence, his mother's hidden letters, Earl's warnings, it all fit now. He had not been chosen by chance. He had been carried forward by the weight of a promise his father made, a promise honored not just in paper, but in flesh and memory. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the desert. Luke walked with Maya to the porch, the book pressed against his chest. "And now," he asked, "what happens now that the truth is out?" Maya's eyes lingered on the horizon. Now the fight changes. It will not always be soldiers and rifles. It will be courts, words, laws written by men who have never seen this land. But with these papers, with this history, they can no longer say we were ghosts. We live in their ink as much as we live in the earth. Luke let her words settle. He had never imagined himself a man for politics or courts. But he understood now that his role was not to fight every battle, but to keep the bridge steady, to ensure that the promise did not vanish again. The weeks turned into months. The judge's ruling reached higher courts. Newspapers picked up the story, and the name Carver appeared in print alongside Apache chiefs. Some papers twisted it into scandal, others into legend. Luke did not care for either. He cared only that the land north of the river remained untouched, recognized as sacred, shielded for another generation. Life at the ranch grew quieter. The cattle still grazed, the windmills still creaked, the desert still stretched endless. But the silence was no longer the same. It carried a weight of respect now, of unseen watchers in the hills, of promises kept alive. One evening, as autumn painted the horizon in gold and crimson, Luke sat on the porch with the leather book in his lap. Maya had written out to her own family, and the ranch was still. He opened the book again, reading the warrior's words by lamplight. They ended not with threat, nor with sorrow, but with a simple vow. We do not forget, neither the wound nor the hand that heals it. Luke closed the book, his gaze lifting to the stars above. His father's shadow no longer felt distant or unspoken. It felt present, woven into the land, into the cattle lowing softly in the dark, into the rhythm of his own breath. He understood at last that legacy was not about blood alone, nor land nor law. It was about the choices that echoed long after a man was gone. The desert would never tell the full story. Outsiders would twist it, forget it, or bury again beneath politics and time. But here, on this stretch of land, the truth lived. Luke Carver leaned back in his chair, the night vast around him. He was no longer just a cowboy. He was a keeper of a story carried in silence, spoken only in moments of need, and passed forward as a torch against the dark. And as the wind stirred through the dry grass, he felt certain of one thing. The promise would endure as long as his blood did.